Hello, Goffstown. My name is Jim Craig, and I'm today's host on Goffstown Today, the local public affairs program brought to you by the Goffstown Democratic Committee. Our goal is to provide meaningful discussions of local and state issues important to the greater Goffstown community. Today, we're going to take a look at a subject that many people have probably heard of, but don't know a lot about. That's the topic of redistricting and the related topic of gerrymandering. So we're going to take a look at those two topics and some of the current legislative attempts to make redistricting fairer and more open. And with us today to help us explain some of these issues is Beihl of the Open Democracy Action, which is a legacy of Granny D. Haddock. Some of you may remember her. She was a great Democratic activist who, when she was probably 88, 90 years old, walked across the country, all the way across the country in support of campaign finance reform. But I'll let Brian talk more about that and your organization. And thank you for being here today, Brian.
I'm tickled to be here. Thank you, Jim. I really appreciate the invitation. And I'm glad you remembered Granny D. Yep. And we're trying to get a Granny D Day passed in New Hampshire. That was one of the pieces of legislation that got killed off in the COVID at the end of the legislative session this year. But we're trying to get a permanent day in her honor.
That's great. That's great. Look how long it took Martin Luther King.
There you go.
Yeah. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what your organization does before we get into it?
Sure. Well, Open Democracy and Open Democracy Action, those are two parts of our organization. Open Democracy does education about campaign finance reform issues, voting rights. We work on disclosure to make sure that people know what kind of money is being spent in our campaign system. But lately, we've also been doing a lot of stuff on a lot of work on absentee voting and making sure that voting is safe for this fall. But we also have put a lot of effort in the last couple of years into redistricting in New Hampshire.
Okay, let's start there. Just briefly, I don't know how much people really know about this subject, but what is redistricting and why do we do it?
Well, every 10 years, with the census, they take account of everybody, and we have to reapportion where people live. And in New Hampshire, most of the redistricting is done by the states, and we have to equally distribute the representation in the state house, the state Senate, the executive council, and that requires that we change the maps in order to do that. Now, there is a fair way to do that, and there is a not so fair way to do that.
When you do it a fair way, what are you looking for? What are you trying to do?
Well, if it's all right with you, Jim, I'd like to throw some graphics up on the screen. It'll help explain what this is about, if that's all right.
Any way you can do it.
All right. There's Granny D, just so you get a good look at her. And voting districts, to answer your question, Jim, they should be in the same geographic area. They need to be contiguous, so they need to be connected with one another. They need voters that have shared community interests. And I'll give you an example of if you have a real rural area that is connected with a very urban area, the needs of those areas are different. Or perhaps one area has natural resources that need to be managed in a different way. And there's also some ways that they shouldn't be chosen. They shouldn't be on the basis of an ideology, whether it's political party or some other type of, let's say, religious affiliation. That's not such a big deal here, but in Utah, that's a big deal, right? And there are areas of the country where that is a problem. Ethnicity. In New Hampshire and Manchester, we have the Greek population, we have the French population, French Canadian population. But now we also have immigrants in Manchester, so and greater Goffstown. And I remember, I've been in New Hampshire long enough. I remember how strong the French Canadian population was in Goffstown. And we don't redistricting done on the basis of race demographics is one of the very common ways of doing gerrymandering. And you find that a lot in the South, but increasingly in the North as well, in some areas.
Okay. And you use the term gerrymandering. In itself, redistricting is a good thing. But how have we managed to turn that into a unfair thing? Or let's put it that way.
Well, exactly right. And way back, this isn't a new thing. Back the whole concept of gerrymandering or manipulating the voting districts for nefarious purposes started way back with a governor in Massachusetts named Jerry. We call it Jerry. His name was Gary. We pronounce it gerrymandering these days, but his name was pronounced Gary. And they figured out a way to change the voting districts to benefit the party that was in power. And that happens both by Republicans and that happens with Democrats. In New Hampshire, it's a primarily Republican history of gerrymandering here. And the most egregious examples of it were really after the 2010 census, so 10 years ago. And there was a redistricting done that rankled a lot of people, and it ended up going to the New Hampshire Supreme Court. It took better part of 2.5 years to complete the redistricting process because of all of the partisan wrangling back and forth. And it finally did get settled by the New Hampshire Supreme Court, which let it lay. And we've been living with the consequences ever since.
Okay, so how is it done now? Who does it? Who redistricts? Who makes the rules, and who figures it out the way it's done now?
So it's the responsibility of the legislature to do the redistricting in New Hampshire. And this is important to note because some of the proposals that have been made, there's some argument over how much that responsibility is the legislature have the ultimate responsibility, sign off on it, or do they have the responsibility of actually doing the work? And so, what happens is that what has happened in the last 10 years is that the last redistricting was all done behind closed doors. So the public didn't really know what was happening. Specialists were brought in, software was used, but we don't know what that software was, and we don't know what specialists were used. And the first time that the public saw, and incidentally, the legislature, the first time they saw the maps from the 2010 to 2012 redistricting was a week before the legislature was to vote on it. There were public hearings where there were no maps to be shown. And one of my colleagues at the League of Women Voters attended 2 of those and found out there were no maps. So it was not a transparent process, I guess is what happened.
And that was the last redistricting, correct?
That is correct.
So it has to be done every 10 years after the 10-year census?
That's right. That's right.
And so what was it, the legislative leaders who did that last time, or?
Yes. So the party in charge currently, under current New Hampshire law, the party in charge is the one that draws the maps. The whole legislature has to vote on it, but it's the party in charge that actually creates the maps. And so that process locks out the other minority party at the time. And if you play your cards right, which is what happened this last time, you can keep people from closely examining how this works, because it's a very sophisticated process. They use computer algorithms looking at voting history to be able to draw lines like this graphic that I have up on the screen, which kind of shows how it gets manipulated. So this one on the far right is the example of how it gets manipulated, where purple has fewer people, but by changing the maps, you can have more districts winning, and that gives you more seating in the legislature. So that's what that graphic is showing, where we want it to actually reflect the party affiliation in the district that the person is representing. So in New Hampshire, go ahead, Jim.
So this current system relies on people being honest, fair, above board, and completely fair-minded in a situation where it's high stakes and it lasts for 10 years, right? So that's the way it's set up, and it doesn't always work that way. That's the crux of it, I think, right?
Exactly right. Exactly right. So
you get some weird districting this way. Are there some anomalies that you can look at? And
so in New Hampshire, the one that everybody points to is the Executive Council District 1. So if I can get this on the screen properly, there we go. You see this blue area over the top, and that is currently Andrew Volinsky's district, which goes from Hinsdale in the southwest corner of the state all the way to Rochester. Hinsdale is a very rural area. And what happened here was that this gerrymandering included all of the major Democratic held towns, Democratic leaning towns, I should say, where it starts and goes through Keene, goes through Concord, and all the way over to Portsmouth. And what it did was it packed Democrats into one district, but left the other districts to be more Republican leaning.
So that was done by Republican leadership?
That was done by Republican leadership in 2010 to 2012, yes.
So you could look at that as that's a Democratic area. We're never going to win there anyway, so we'll make that contiguous in one district and we'll take the rest, something.
Correct.
That's gerrymandering. That's the kind of thing, the thinking that subverts this process. Is that correct?
What it does is it dilutes the power of your vote. So if you are it just doesn't represent the district fairly. And so you end up, in the case of a place like Wisconsin, with more Democratic votes, but far more legislators, Republican legislators in the legislature. So it's fascinating. It's a little closer here. New Hampshire is a purple state and has been swinging back and forth a little bit, but it is something where in 2016, the gerrymandering that was done resulted in, according to the Associated Press, 23 House seats flipped as a result of that.
Wow. Okay, so the way it is now, there's a process, and it's not. It trusts human nature maybe a little bit too much. And I understand. I know that there have been several attempts to try to make this fairer and more open, and so would you, I'm sure you know about those, and would you explain what the legislature is doing to try to fix these issues? And by the way, before you do that, how would that affect, how could gerrymandering affect somebody in Goffstown who's a Democrat, or how does it take representation away from you?
Well, as I understand it, Goffstown's a pretty...
you don't have to use Goffstown, but how would it take a voter's rights away from him or her?
So if you're in the majority in the votes in your community, but it's gerrymandered in such a way that the that the power is in the hands of a smaller number of people, your vote, where you should have proper representation, you should be represented by proportionately in the way you are you are not represented proportionately when gerrymandering occurs. If the districts are done properly, you should have the same percentage of representation that you have voters in an ideal world. And it's always, it's not a perfect thing. This is something that gets, it's more art than science in some cases, but now lately the science is having more of an impact on it. If you,
yeah, at least in this case.
Right.
So yeah, and I'm sorry for interrupting you, but would tell me what's going on in the legislature now to try to make this better, this situation better.
So there are what other states are doing. We have 3 different models that states have looked at. One is just a bipartisan. It's still a legislature drawn map, but those commissions have equal numbers in them, okay, of legislators. Then you have advisory, and by the word advisory, we're talking about the legislature has the final word, okay?
Right.
So in New Hampshire, and this is what we have, an advisory independent redistricting commission. That's what's being proposed.
We don't have that, but
we don't have it yet, but it's what's being proposed.
Right. And
has passed in 2019 and in 2020 with bipartisan votes in New Hampshire. So in 2019, oh, sorry, I have to complete my thought here. So the fully independent redistricting commissions are what California has. They have independent commissioners that draw the maps. They are elected positions, but they draw the maps and they are not responsible to the legislature in that case. Okay.
Yep.
Then we have in New Hampshire, in 2019, there have been other attempts, but in 2019, HB 706 got a healthy bipartisan vote in the House. It was a unanimous vote in the Senate, which is a pretty amazing thing,
Yep.
but then got vetoed by the governor in September, in June of last year.
So why, my question, if it was bipartisan and unanimous in the Senate, why would the governor veto that?
Well, that's a very, very good question. There were, as we understand it, the governor was ready to sign that bill. We do understand that he took some advice from the Republican National Republican Redistricting Trust, of which Governor Scott Walker, a former Governor Scott Walker in Wisconsin, one of the most gerrymandered states in the country, is the treasurer. And way we understand is that Governor Sununu was talked out of signing this bill. But in his veto statement, his rationale was, one, he didn't like the out-of-state influence because there was a national group that put a newspaper ad in supporting the Independent Redistricting Commission. And he also said that gerrymandering is rare in New Hampshire. Well, gerrymandering isn't exactly rare here. It's not as bad as it is in other states, but it's not rare either. And then there were other bills, SB 8, which is very similar. CACR 9 is an important one to talk about too.
Before you get on that, what happened to the veto? Was it overridden, or was it still pending, or was it?
They did not have the 2/3 majority to override in that case. So we weren't successful in that one, but there was clearly a lot of support for this in the legislature. And in the veto vote, the override vote last year, there were several legislators who did support the governor and voted against it, against the override, even though they had voted for the commission in the first place.
Okay, so what, can you just give us a quick overview of what that would have done, how that would have changed the system if it had passed?
Absolutely. And I don't need to have this up on the screen. I'm going to just drop that. So the redistricting commissions have all been different flavors. There have been different versions of a core bill. Now, what is coming up, there was another bill called HB 1665, which attempted to answer all of the governor's concerns, which the governor then promptly vetoed again this summer. That was the 2020 bill. So our information is indicating that a bill more similar to HB 706 will be proposed. And what this does is it has 15 commissioners. 5 of them are Democrats, 5 of them are Republicans, and 5 are independent or third-party candidates. Now, you start out with 10 nominations from each party, okay? Right. And they choose each other. So they are objecting to the other party's nomination, similar to the way you impanel a jury. So you get a mutually agreed upon group of 20, or 10 rather, excuse me, 10. And then those 10 are going to select the remaining 5 independents and third-party candidates. So they have, what they're trying to do is they're trying to take the partisan politics out of it. There have been other proposals where they go through a more rigorous, you can't have been a legislator, you can't be a lobbyist. The newer versions of the bill are allowing that, but you have to disclose everything. If you want to be a commissioner, you have to disclose what party, what your legislative background is, if you've ever done lobbying, the people you work for, et cetera, so that there's no conflict of interest, or minimizes the conflict of interest.
And would there be public participation in this process?
Well, that is the big thing, in my opinion, that the public will be able to go to all meetings of this independent redistricting commission, advisory commission, that they can see the process of building the maps. They can see the software that was used. And then there's a process where they have to, similar to what has been in the past, there are public hearings in every county in New Hampshire. So the public has a chance to go have their say. And the legislature does have the final word. This is one of the big concerns between Republicans and Democrats, is that our Constitution says that the legislature has to have the authority over redistricting. So by having the legislature being able to amend the maps, it's possible, if you had nefarious players who wanted to muck things up, they could. But because of the public scrutiny of the process, we think we're comfortable with this being a fair and equitable solution.
Yeah, they say the sunshine heals all wounds, or whatever, So I think that sounds like a good idea. I know it is a good idea, and I thank you for. We're running out of time, unfortunately, and thank you for that. That's very interesting, and it's something that is so fundamental to our democracy that people really need to understand what's going on. That's just bottom line. So thank you again, Brian, for coming today. So
my pleasure. Great to be with you, Jim. And I hope Goffstown moves forward in supporting their redistricting. I know they've done that, so that's great.
Okay. In conclusion, you can watch these programs here on GTV through the video page on our website, gofftowndems.com, by searching for the Goffstown Democrats YouTube channel or on our Facebook page, www.facebook.com/GoffstownDems. Please like them and share them widely, and thank you for watching.